The Orphan of the Dust. The sun over the village of Omu was not a friend, it was a witness to misery. It beat down on the back of young Adama, a girl whose only crime was surviving her parents. In Omu, if you have no mother to speak for you and no father to shield you, you are not a child, you are a shadow. Adama lived in the shadow of her Aunt Zola, a woman whose heart was as dry as the harmattan wind and twice as biting. Every morning, before the first cock crowed, Adama's day began with a kick. Not a word of kindness, but a heavy leather sandal to her ribs. "Get up, daughter of a curse!" Zola would scream. Adama would scramble from her mat of thin straw, her bones aching from the cold floor. Her job was simple but soul-crushing: fetch water from the distant stream, scrub the floors until her fingernails bled, and cook meals she was barely allowed to smell, let alone taste. But there was one rule in Zola's house that was stranger than all the rest. Adama was forbidden from crying. "If I see a single drop of salt on your face," Zola would hiss, leaning in so close Adama could smell the fermented locust beans on her breath, "I will give you a reason to weep that the ancestors will hear in the underworld." Zola believed that tears brought bad luck to a house. She believed an orphan's grief was a poison that would rot her roof and sour her milk. So, Adama became a master of the silent scream. When she burned her hand on the cooking pot, she bit her lip until it turned white. When Zola slapped her for walking too loudly, Adama swallowed the lump in her throat until it felt like a stone. She was a pressure cooker of sorrow, a girl filled with a lake of unshed grief, waiting for the one spark that would make the dam burst. The villagers watched her pass with buckets of water, her eyes dull and dry. They whispered that the girl was made of wood. They didn't know that inside, Adama was drowning. She was waiting for a sign, a memory, or a miracle. But in Omu, miracles were expensive, and Adama was penniless. She was just the orphan of the dust, and the dust was starting to settle in her soul. A night of broken dreams. The moon was a sharp silver hook in the sky the night Adama's world finally shattered. While the rest of the village slept, Adama sat in the corner of the soot-stained kitchen, clutching a small, dirt-caked wooden doll. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. The wood was smooth from years of Adama's thumb rubbing against it in the dark. To her, it didn't smell like old timber. It smelled like wood smoke and the sweet shea butter her mother used to wear. "Mother," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the dark. "How much longer? My heart is heavy, and the walls are closing in." Suddenly, the door creaked open. Zola stood there, a flickering oil lamp casting demonic shadows across her face. Her eyes locked onto the small doll in Adama's hands. Greed and spite are sisters, and Zola was possessed by both. "What is that filth?" Zola demanded, her voice a low growl. "Back." It is nothing, Auntie," Adama stammered, trying to hide the doll behind her. But Zola was fast. She lunged forward, her iron-strong fingers gripping Adama's wrist until the girl winced. She snatched the doll away. "You spend your time playing with idols instead of scrubbing the mortar? This is why you are lazy. This is why you are a burden." Before Adama could scream, Zola threw the doll into the dying embers of the cooking fire. The dry wood caught instantly. Adama watched, paralyzed, as her mother's face charred and turned to ash. The last physical link to her past was vanishing in a plume of gray smoke. "Now," Zola hissed, "go to sleep. And remember, not a single tear, or you sleep in the forest with the hyenas tonight." Zola slammed the door, leaving Adama in total darkness. The silence was louder than a roar. Adama felt the familiar pressure in her chest, the burning in her eyes. But this time, the dam didn't just leak, it exploded. She fell to her knees, clutching her stomach, and let out a sob so deep it felt like her lungs were tearing. She wept for her mother, for her father, for her broken childhood, and for the doll that was now nothing but soot. She cried until her throat was raw, the salt water flowing freely down her cheeks and dripping onto the dirt floor. She didn't care about the rules. She didn't care about the forest. She just wanted to disappear. The glistening floor. Morning light crept into the kitchen through the cracks in the mud walls, finding Adama slumped on the floor. She had cried herself into a deep, exhausted sleep. Her face was swollen, and her throat felt like she had swallowed sand. She expected to wake up to a kick, but instead, the house was strangely quiet. As she pushed herself up, she felt something hard and cold pressing into her palms. She looked down, expecting to see pebbles or dried mud. Instead, her eyes widened until they hurt. Spread across the dirt floor, exactly where her tears had fallen the night before, were dozens of small, irregular yellow stones. They weren't just stones. They caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant, shimmering rays. Adama picked one up. It was heavy. Much heavier than any rock. She bit it, just as she had seen the village traders do with coins. Her teeth left no mark, but the metallic taste was unmistakable. It was gold. Pure, raw, shimmering gold. Adama's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the floor again. Every place a tear had landed, a golden nugget sat. There was a fortune at her feet, enough to buy the entire village, enough to run away and never look back. "I have to hide it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If Zola sees this—" She frantically began digging a small hole in the corner of the kitchen, burying the gold beneath the soot and ash. She scrubbed her face, trying to hide the evidence of her weeping. But how do you hide the fact that your sorrow has become wealth? How do you hide a miracle when you live with a monster? As she finished covering the last piece, the door swung open. Zola walked in, her nose in the air, sniffing for trouble. She looked at Adama's swollen eyes and smirked. "You cried, didn't you? You dared to break my rule." Zola stepped into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the floor for any sign of bad luck. She didn't see the gold, but she saw a single stray shimmering grain that Adama had missed. She bent down, her brow furrowed, and picked up the tiny yellow speck. The air in the room suddenly felt very cold. Adama realized that the gold wasn't her ticket to freedom. It was a golden cage, and the door was about to lock. The ant's discovery. The silence in the kitchen was so heavy it felt like it would crack the mud walls. Aunt Zola held the tiny yellow grain between her thumb and forefinger, squinting at it in the morning light. Adama stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. She prayed to the ancestors that Zola would think it was just a strange bit of sand or a fragment of a brass pot. But Zola was a woman who could smell a single copper coin from a mile away. Zola bit the grain. Her eyes, usually dull and filled with spite, suddenly ignited with a terrifying, predatory hunger. She looked at the floor, then at Adama's swollen, red-rimmed eyes. She looked back at the dirt corner where Adama had frantically tried to hide the rest. "Move," Zola whispered. It wasn't a request. It was a death threat. Adama didn't move fast enough. Zola shoved her aside with such force that the girl hit the wall, her head ringing. Zola fell to her knees, clawing at the dirt like a crazed animal. She dug with her bare fingernails, throwing soot and ash into the air until she hit something hard. A gasp escaped her throat, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pulled out a handful of gold nuggets, each one the size of a kola nut, glowing with an unnatural pure light. "Gold!" Zola breathed, her voice trembling. "My kitchen floor is growing gold." She turned to Adama, her face twisted into a mask of greed that was more frightening than her anger. How did this get here? Did you steal this from the king's caravan? Tell me, or I will cut the tongue from your mouth." I don't know, Auntie," Adama lied, her voice shaking. "I just woke up, and it was there." Zola grabbed Adama by the hair, pulling her face close. She saw the tear tracks still visible on the girl's dusty cheeks. She looked at the gold, then back at the tears. A slow, wicked realization began to spread across Zola's face. She picked up a wooden bowl and shoved it under Adama's chin. "Cry," Zola commanded. "Auntie, please." "Cry," Zola screamed, slapping the girl across the face. "Cry for me, you useless brat. If your tears are made of gold, you are no longer a burden. You are mine. Cry, or I will give you a reason to weep that will last a lifetime." Adama tried, but her heart was paralyzed with fear. The tears wouldn't come. The well of her grief had been replaced by a desert of terror. Zola realized then that the bad luck of an orphan's tears was the greatest lie she had ever told herself. She didn't want Adama to be happy. She wanted her to be a fountain of misery that she could harvest. The Room of Sorrows. By sunset, the life Adama knew was gone. Zola had dragged her to a small windowless storage hut at the back of the compound, a place where they usually kept rotting yams and rusted tools. The air was thick with the smell of mold and damp earth. There was no mat, no blanket, only a single wooden stool and a series of empty clay pots lined up against the wall. "This is your home now," Zola hissed as she pushed Adama inside. "You will stay here until every one of these pots is filled with gold. Do you understand?" "Auntie, I can't," Adama sobbed, the fear finally breaking through. "I can't just cry on command. It hurts." Zola's smile was as sharp as a razor. "Oh, you will cry. I will make sure of it." She slammed the heavy wooden door and bolted it from the outside. Adama was plunged into total darkness. She could hear the skittering of rats in the thatch roof and the distant sound of the village settling down for the night. For the first time, she was truly alone. The walls felt like they were leaning in, suffocating her. Hours passed. Adama sat on the cold floor, her knees pulled to her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's doll burning in the fire. The grief was there, bubbling just beneath the surface, but the pressure to produce made her throat tighten. She knew that if she cried, she was only feeding Zola's madness. If she didn't cry, she would starve. Outside, she heard the clinking of metal. Zola was sitting by the door, sharpening a machete. The rhythmic shhh of stone against steel was a psychological torture. "Still dry in there, little bird?" Zola's voice drifted through the cracks. "Don't worry. Tomorrow, I will bring the pepper. We will see if your eyes can resist the sting of the red bird's eye chili." Adama let out a soft, broken whimper. A single tear escaped and hit the dirt. Clink. The sound of metal hitting the floor echoed in the silence. Even in her terror, the magic remained. She had become a prisoner of her own value. She wasn't a girl anymore. She was a treasure chest that Zola intended to break open by any means necessary. The drought of tears. 3 days had passed, and the Room of Sorrows had become a place of silent war. Zola had tried everything. She had deprived Adama of water, she had burnt pungent herbs that made the girl's eyes sting and burn, and she had spent hours describing how she would sell Adama to the traveling slavers if the gold didn't start flowing faster. But a strange thing was happening. Adama's body was fighting back. The more Zola traumatized her, the more Adama's spirit retreated into a hard, cold shell. Her eyes were red and inflamed, but they were dry. It was as if her soul knew that her tears were now currency, and it refused to pay the tax. "You are doing this to spite me," Zola roared on the 4th morning, kicking over an empty pot. "I have spent a fortune on new clothes and palm wine, telling the traders I have found a hidden stash in the forest. If I don't have more gold by the market day, they will call me a liar." Zola's greed had already begun to rot the village. She had started buying things she didn't need, silks from the north, ivory combs, and expensive spices, all on the promise of more to come. The villagers were whispering. They saw the orphan girl had vanished, and they saw Zola acting like a queen. In the village square, Kojo, the blacksmith's son, watched Zola with a heavy heart. He had always been kind to Adama, often leaving a piece of fruit or a bit of roasted yam by the stream for her. He noticed the bruises on Zola's arms from where she had been digging in the dirt, and he heard the faint, muffled sounds coming from the storage hut when he passed by late at night. Inside the hut, Adama was fading. Her voice was gone, and her lips were cracked. She looked at the empty pots and felt a strange sense of victory in her suffering. "If I die," she thought, "she gets nothing." But the darkness of the hut was playing tricks on her. She began to see her mother standing in the corner, her face soft and glowing. "Don't give up, my flower," the vision seemed to say. "The gold is not for her. It is for the justice that is coming." Adama reached out a trembling hand, and for the first time in days, a genuine tear of longing, not of fear, welled up in her eye. As it fell, it didn't sound like a clink. It sounded like a low, vibrating hum. The gold was changing. Wealth is more pungent than rotting fish. Within a week, Aunt Zola had transformed from a bitter widow in tattered wrappers to a woman draped in expensive lace that scratched her skin and smelled of imported perfumes. She didn't just walk through the village of Omu, she paraded. She bought a massive goat with a single gold nugget, refusing to take change, laughing as the merchant's jaw dropped. "The ancestors have smiled upon my roof," she would shout to anyone who would listen. "They have seen my kindness to that wretched orphan and rewarded me with a hidden spring of gold in the forest." But the villagers weren't fools. They saw that Adama had vanished. They saw the heavy brass padlock on the storage hut behind Zola's house. They noticed that while Zola grew fat on pounded yam and bushmeat, no smoke rose from the kitchen for the girl. The village elders whispered in the shade of the great baobab tree. "A forest doesn't give gold to a woman with a heart of stone," the eldest whispered, his eyes narrowing as Zola tossed a handful of cowries to a beggar with the arrogance of a queen. Tension began to crawl through Omu like a snake in high grass. Greed is a contagious fever. Seeing Zola's wealth, the price of everything in the market doubled overnight. The palm wine tappers demanded gold instead of shells. The weavers stopped working, hoping to find Zola's secret spring themselves. The harmony of the village was splintering. Every man looked at his neighbor with suspicion, wondering who would be the first to steal Zola's secret. Behind the locked door of the hut, Adama heard the music and the laughter from Zola's constant feasts. The irony was a knife in her heart. She was the source of the celebration, yet she was starving in the dark, her only company the cold yellow stones that refused to feed her. The false celebration. Zola knew the whispers were growing dangerous. To silence the village elders and prove she wasn't a kidnapper, she announced a grand celebration of recovery. She claimed that Adama had fallen ill with a sacred fever and was being kept in seclusion for her own safety, but that she would soon be the guest of honor at a feast that would last 3 days. "I will kill a cow," Zola bragged at the market. "There will be more palm wine than water in the stream. And my dear niece, Adama, will sit by my side, draped in the finest silk." In reality, Zola was desperate. The drought of tears had returned. Adama, sensing the growing evil, had closed her heart so tightly that even Zola's most brutal pinches produced nothing but dry gasps. Zola began to panic. She had promised gold to the merchants for the cow, the wine, and the silk. If she didn't produce a pot of gold by the morning of the feast, her creditors would strip her bare and throw her into the village square. That night, Zola entered the hut not with a whip, but with a bowl of honeyed porridge. "Eat, my little gold mine," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake honey. "Eat and be happy. If you are happy, maybe you will cry tears of joy. They say joy gold is even purer." Adama looked at the bowl, then at the woman who had burned her mother's memory. She pushed the bowl away. "There is no joy in this house, Auntie. Only the gold of ghosts." Zola's face contorted. The mask of kindness shattered instantly. She grabbed Adama's throat, her fingers digging into the girl's windpipe. "Then you will cry tears of pain. If I have to peel the skin from your back to make you weep, I will do it before the sun rises." She threw the porridge against the wall, the sweet scent filling the room like a mockery. As Zola stormed out, she didn't notice a shadow moving near the back of the hut. The midnight escape. Kojo, the blacksmith's son, had spent the evening sharpening his courage instead of his father's blades. He couldn't sleep knowing Adama was trapped in that den of greed. Armed with a heavy iron file and a small pouch of dried meat, he crawled through the shadows of Zola's compound, avoiding the drunken guard Zola had hired with her blood gold. He reached the back of the storage hut and whispered through a crack in the mud. "Adama, it is Kojo. Do not scream." A small, trembling hand appeared in the crack. "Kojo, go away. If she finds you, she will kill us both." "I am not leaving without you," Kojo hissed. He began to work the iron file against the base of the wooden door frame. The sound was covered by the loud drumming and singing from Zola's house, where she was already celebrating her expected harvest. For an hour, Kojo worked until his hands bled. Finally, a heavy plank groaned and gave way. He reached into the darkness and pulled Adama out. She was so light, so thin, that he felt a surge of rage that almost made him roar. "We must go to the forest," Kojo whispered, wrapping his cloth around her shivering shoulders. "The elders are afraid of Zola's wealth, but the spirits of the trees do not care for gold." As they began to slip away into the tall grass, Adama looked back at the hut. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for the girl she used to be, the one who didn't have gold in her eyes. A single tear fell into the grass. It didn't make a clink. Instead, the grass where the tear fell instantly turned into sharp, golden needles. Kojo gasped, pulling her away. "The magic is getting stronger," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "It isn't just gold anymore, Adama. It's a weapon." Behind them, the lights of Zola's celebration flickered, unaware that the treasure had just walked into the woods. The Pact of Silence. The forest at night was a cathedral of shadows, where the trees seemed to lean in and whisper secrets older than the village of Omu. Kojo led Adama deeper into the thicket, his hand gripping hers so tightly his knuckles were white. He could feel her trembling, not just from the cold, but from the sheer weight of the magic coursing through her. "We must reach the old blacksmith's cave," Kojo whispered, his eyes darting toward every snapping twig. "My father says it is protected by the spirits of iron. Zola's gold madness cannot enter there." Adama stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Kojo, you don't understand. The gold, it's not a gift anymore. It feels like a fever in my blood. Every time I think of my mother, or the fire, or the hunger, I feel it gathering behind my eyes like molten lead." They reached the cave, a jagged mouth in the side of a moss-covered hill. Inside, the air smelled of cold stone and ancient soot. Kojo built a small, hidden fire, shielding the light with his cloak. He handed Adama the dried meat, and for the first time in weeks, she ate. "Listen to me," Kojo said, his voice solemn. "From this moment on, you must never cry. Not for sadness, not for joy. If the world finds out you are a living treasury, they will hunt you. Not just Zola, but the king, the neighboring tribes, and the greedy men from across the great water. We must make a pact. I will be your shield, and you will be my silence." Adama looked into the flickering flames. "How can a human live without tears, Kojo? It is like asking the sky never to rain. Eventually, the clouds will burst. Then we must make sure that when they do, you are far away from anyone who would steal your sorrow," he replied. But even as they spoke, a low, metallic hum vibrated through the cave. Adama looked down. Where her sweat had dripped onto the stone floor, small golden veins were beginning to spiderweb through the rock. The magic was no longer waiting for her grief, it was feeding on her very exhaustion. The king's taxman. While Adama hid in the cave, the village of Omu was waking up to a nightmare of greed. Aunt Zola's grand celebration had turned into a chaotic brawl. When the sun rose and the promised cow was not slaughtered, because Zola had no more gold to pay the butcher, the village turned on her. "Where is the girl?" the butcher demanded, waving his cleaver. "Where is the forest spring you bragged about?" Zola stood on her porch, her expensive silk wrapper torn, her hair disheveled. "She is gone. The blacksmith's boy stole her. They have taken my wealth into the woods." The shouting was silenced by the blast of a bronze horn. A procession of soldiers in crimson tunics marched into the square, led by a man with a face as sharp as a spearhead. It was Lord Jengo, the king's high taxman. He had heard rumors of a woman in Omu who paid for goats with raw, unrefined gold, gold that was purer than anything in the royal treasury. "Where is the source?" Jengo asked, his voice a cold silk. He didn't look at the villagers, he looked only at Zola. "My lord," Zola groveled, hitting the dirt. "It is the girl, Adama. Her tears, they turn to gold. But she has been kidnapped." Jengo's eyes didn't flicker with surprise. They sparked with a dark, calculated hunger. To the king, a girl who cried gold was better than 1,000 tax collectors. She was the power to buy armies, to build palaces of sun metal, and to crush every rival kingdom. "If she is in the forest," Jengo commanded his soldiers, "burn the forest. If she is in a house, level the village. I want the golden girl brought to the palace in chains. And as for you," he looked down at Zola, "you will lead us to her, or your head will decorate the village gate by noon." The ultimate cruelty. The hunt began with the smell of smoke. From the mouth of their cave, Adama and Kojo watched in horror as the horizon turned a bruised orange. The king's men were setting fire to the outskirts of the woods to flush them out. "They are coming," Adama whispered. She could hear the baying of hounds and the rhythmic clank of armor. Kojo grabbed his iron file and a heavy smithing hammer he had brought. "Run, Adama. Follow the stream upward. It leads to the high peaks. I will hold them here." "No. They will kill you." "They want you, not me," Kojo said, pushing her toward the back of the cave. "Go." But he was too late. A net made of weighted ropes flew through the air, entangling Kojo and dragging him to the ground. Lord Django stepped into the cave, followed by a trembling Zola. "So," Django said, stepping over the small fire. "The little miracle." Zola lunged forward, grabbing Adama by the shoulders and shaking her. "You brat! You ruined me! Look at what you've done! They've burned my house! Now cry! Cry until this cave is filled with gold, or I will watch them execute this boy right in front of your eyes." Django signaled to a soldier. A blade was pressed against Kojo's throat. A thin line of red appeared on his skin. "Wait!" Adama screamed. The pressure in her chest was unbearable. It felt like a mountain was resting on her heart. She looked at Kojo's brave, terrified eyes. She looked at Zola's twisted, ugly face. "You want gold?" Adama's voice changed. It wasn't the voice of a girl anymore. It was deep and resonant, like the earth itself speaking. "I will give you what you deserve." She didn't sob. She didn't wail. She let out a single silent tear of pure, agonizing sacrifice. As it hit the floor, the cave didn't fill with nuggets. A shockwave of golden energy erupted, turning the very air into a shimmering, suffocating dust. The journey of mourning. The air in the cave was no longer oxygen. It was a suspension of gold dust that coated the lungs and stung the eyes. Lord Django did not cough. He inhaled it like a drug. He watched as the shockwave from Adama's tear settled, leaving the cave walls encrusted with a thin, shimmering foil. "Magnificent," Django whispered. He signaled his men, who moved forward with heavy iron shackles. "Bind her, but do not bruise her. Every mark on her skin is a potential loss of revenue." Adama was led out of the cave in a cage of reinforced bamboo and iron, draped in a black cloth so the common people could not see the source of the king's new fortune. Kojo was dragged behind the cage, his hands bound with rough hemp, a constant reminder to Adama that his life depended on her compliance. The journey to the capital was a funeral procession for Adama's soul. Every bump in the rugged forest path sent a jolt of pain through her malnourished body. Every time she groaned, Zola, who had been kept as a handler, would poke a sharp stick through the bamboo bars. "Cry, you miserable girl!" Zola would hiss, her voice rasping from the smoke. "The taxman says if the cage isn't heavy with gold by the time we reach the great gates, he will feed your blacksmith friend to the crocodiles in the palace moat." Adama looked through the cracks of the black cloth. She saw the charred remains of the forest she once loved. She saw villagers lining the road, their eyes hollow with hunger, watching the king's soldiers pass. She realized then that her gift was a plague. Wherever she went, greed followed, burning everything in its path. She tried to hold back her emotions, but the sheer cruelty of the journey forced small, silent beads of moisture from her eyes. Each one hit the floor of the cage with a heavy clink, adding to the weight the soldiers had to carry. To them, it was wealth. To Adama, it was the sound of her life ticking away. The Palace of Greed. The capital was a city of stone and secrets, dominated by a palace that sat atop a hill like a vulture. King Malachi did not greet Adama with a throne. He greeted her in the Chamber of Refinement, a room lined with mirrors so he could watch her from every angle. Malachi was a man of cold marble and sharp silk. He walked around Adama's cage, his rings clicking against the bamboo. "They say you are a miracle," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "But I see only a girl. A girl who is very, very sad." "I am not a miracle," Adama whispered, her voice cracking. "I am a curse." The king laughed, a sound like dry leaves. "A curse that buys armies is a blessing to a king. I have a war to fund in the north, and a monument to build in my own honor. You will be my architect." He turned to Lord Django. "I want a statue, not of stone, but of solid, tear-born gold. It shall be a likeness of myself, 10 cubits high. Use whatever encouragement is necessary. If the girl stops producing, begin removing the fingers of the blacksmith boy, one by one, until the well runs deep again." Adama was moved to a pedestal in the center of the room. The mirrors reflected her misery back at her 1,000 times. She was surrounded by wealth she could never spend and a king who saw her only as a tap to be turned. She looked into the mirrors and didn't recognize herself. Her skin was sallow, her eyes sunken, and her heart felt like it had been replaced by a cold, heavy ingot. The forest spirit's warning. Among the king's court was an old, blind seer named Motsi. He had been the king's advisor for 40 years, but he had grown silent as Malachi's greed grew louder. On the third night of Adama's captivity, Motsi was led into the chamber of refinement. He didn't need eyes to feel the heavy, oppressive energy of the gold in the room. "Your Majesty," Motsi said, his voice trembling as he leaned on his staff, "I hear the sound of the earth weeping. This gold, it has a heartbeat. It is not dead metal. It is living sorrow." "Silence, old man," the king snapped, admiring a newly formed golden brick. "The gold is silent and obedient." Motsi turned his sightless face toward Adama. "Child, listen to me. Gold born of pain is not wealth, it is a debt. The more you give them, the more they owe the spirits of the earth. When the debt is called, it will not be paid in coins. It will be paid in blood and rain." He turned back to the king, his voice rising in a chilling chant. "Gold born of pain brings a heavy rain. The more you hoard, the sharper the sword. When the orphan's heart turns to stone, the king shall sit on a hollow throne." The king roared in anger and had Motsi dragged from the room. But the warning hung in the air like the smell of an approaching storm. Adama felt a strange shiver go down her spine. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than sadness. She felt a spark of righteous anger. That night, as she sat on her pedestal, she looked at the growing pile of gold at her feet. It was glowing with a faint, sickly green light. The gold was waiting. It was hungry. And Adama realized that she was no longer just a victim. She was a vessel for a power that the king could not possibly control. The night of the blood moon. The sky over the capital did not turn black that night. It turned a bruised, sickly purple. A blood moon hung low, a heavy red eye watching the city of stone. Inside the palace, King Malachi was obsessed. He had dismissed his guards, his wives, and his advisors, staying alone in the chamber of refinement with Adama and the piles of shimmering metal. "More," he whispered, his fingers stained gray from handling the raw gold. "The statue's left hand is still hollow. Give me more." Adama sat on her pedestal, her body a skeletal frame held together by spite. Beside her, Kojo was tied to a stone pillar, his head hanging low. Every time Adama's eyes went dry, the king would signal a torturer to tighten the ropes around Kojo's wrists. The cruelty was no longer a means to an end, it had become the king's ritual. "Look at him, Adama," the king mocked, pointing at Kojo. "He suffers because you are stingy with your grief. One more sob, and I might let him drink some water." Adama looked at Kojo, then at the mirrors reflecting 1,000 versions of her own misery. She felt a strange, cold vibration starting in the soles of her feet. It wasn't the shaking of fear. It was the earth itself humming. Outside, the wind began to howl, a sound like 1,000 flutes played by ghosts. The blood moon's light bled through the high windows, turning the gold in the room a terrifying, deep crimson. "The moon is hungry, king," Adama said, her voice sounding like grinding stones. "Can't you feel it? The gold is waking up." The final tear. Malachi ignored her, reaching out to grab a large nugget that had just fallen from Adama's cheek. But as his skin touched the metal, he shrieked. The gold was boiling. It wasn't hot like fire, but it hummed with a psychic heat that blistered his palms. "What have you done?" the king roared, reaching for his sword. "You have cursed my treasury." Adama stood up. The shackles on her ankles, made of the very gold she had cried, began to melt and flow like honey. She looked at the king, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an orphan. She felt like a storm. "You asked for my tears," she said, her voice echoing off the mirrors until it sounded like a choir of the dead. "You asked for the depth of my soul. But you forgot one thing, king. A heart can only break so many times before it turns into a weapon." She thought of the burnt doll. She thought of the room of sorrows. She thought of Kojo's bleeding wrists, and the forest turned to ash. The grief was gone, replaced by a searing, white-hot righteousness. She squeezed her eyes shut, and a single massive tear escaped. It wasn't yellow. It wasn't gold. It was a drop of liquid fire, glowing with the light of a dying star. As it hit the floor, the sound wasn't a clink. It was a crack of thunder that shattered every mirror in the room. The curse unleashed. The final tear touched the mountain of gold nuggets, and the transformation was instantaneous and horrific. The gold did not melt, it sprouted legs. It grew wings of jagged metal. It developed mandibles as sharp as obsidian. The gold was turning into locusts. Millions of golden insects erupted from the piles, their wings clashing with a deafening metallic roar. They didn't fly toward the windows, they flew toward the king. Malachi screamed, flailing his arms as the golden swarm covered him, not biting his flesh, but sticking to him, coating him in a layer of suffocating, heavy metal. "My gold!" he gasped, even as the insects crawled into his mouth, sealing his throat with precious, deadly weight. "It's mine." The swarm spread. It flowed out of the chamber like a river of molten jewelry, pouring down the palace hallways. It found Lord Jengo in his counting-house. It found the guards who had mocked Adama's hunger. Every person who had touched the pain gold, with greed in their hearts, found themselves pinned to the floor by the very wealth they had stolen. In the center of the chaos, Adama walked toward Kojo. The golden locusts parted for her like water. She touched his bindings, and the ropes turned to soft silk and fell away. "It's over, Kojo," she whispered. But the palace was groaning. The weight of the golden swarm was too much for the stone foundations. The king's monument to himself was becoming his tomb. Chaos in the kingdom. The capital of Omu did not fall to an invading army, it fell to its own reflection. As the golden locusts swarmed out of the palace windows, they descended upon the city like a shimmering, metallic fog. They did not eat the crops, and they did not bite the cattle. They sought out only one thing, the gold Adama had cried in her weeks of misery. In the market, the greedy merchants who had hoarded the orphan's pebbles watched in horror as their locked chests began to rattle. The gold inside didn't just sit there, it vibrated with a high-pitched scream that shattered clay pots. Then, the lids burst open. The coins and nuggets transformed into thousands of tiny, golden-winged harvesters. They flew back toward the palace, stripping the rich of their jewelry and the corrupt of their bribes. "My wealth! It's flying away!" a nobleman shrieked, clutching at his neck as his heavy gold chain turned into a metallic serpent and slithered into the sky. The city was a storm of yellow light. The sky was no longer purple, it was blocked out by the sheer mass of the swarm. But as the locusts gathered, they became heavy. The weight of the gold was returning to its source. The palace, built on a foundation of pride and taxed labor, began to groan. Cracks spider-webbed through the marble floors. The golden statue of the king, half-finished and hollow, began to leak a thick black smoke that smelled of burnt dreams. The spirit's justice. In the heart of the crumbling throne room, Aunt Zola was trapped. She had been trying to stuff her pockets with the stray nuggets during the chaos, but the gold was sticking to her skin like hot wax. She was a statue of greed, her arms frozen in a reach for a wealth she could no longer carry. Suddenly, the air in the room grew cold, not the cold of winter, but the cold of the deep earth. 3 tall shadows emerged from the swirling gold dust. They were the forest spirits, their skin the color of ancient bark and their eyes like glowing emeralds. They did not look at the gold, they looked at the hearts of the people in the room. "You took the sorrow of a child and tried to buy the sun," the tallest spirit spoke, his voice like the rustling of 1,000 leaves. Zola tried to scream, but her lips were already turning to gray, weathered stone. The spirits gestured, and the golden locusts settled on Zola and the king, who was already encased in his metallic tomb. Their bodies didn't bleed, they simply hardened. They became the very thing they loved most, cold, unfeeling monuments. The spirits turned to Adama, who was shielding Kojo from the falling debris. Their expressions softened. "The debt is paid, little seed," the spirit whispered. "The earth has taken back what was stolen from your heart. But remember, gold is only heavy if you carry it alone." With a wave of a wooden staff, the spirits vanished, and the palace roof gave way, letting in the first rays of a clean gray dawn. The gold didn't disappear, but it lost its shine. It turned back into ordinary, dull lead, worthless to any merchant. The blessing of peace. A year had passed since the night the gold flew. The city of the king was now a ruin, a place where people went only to remember the cost of greed. But far away, in a small valley where the grass was always green and the water always sweet, a new house had been built. It wasn't made of stone or gold, but of sturdy timber and love. Adama sat on the porch, watching the sunset. Her face was full and healthy, and her eyes, once dull and red, were now as clear as a mountain spring. Kojo sat beside her, his hands no longer bound, but busy carving a new wooden doll for Adama. It looked exactly like the one Zola had burned, down to the small smile on the mother's face. "Do you ever miss it?" Kojo asked softly, nodding toward her eyes. "The power." Adama smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "I never had power, Kojo. I had a cage. Now I have the wind." A small child from the neighboring farm ran up to them, crying because he had scraped his knee. Adama pulled him into her lap and wiped his face. As a tear fell from the boy's eye onto Adama's hand, she didn't look for a clink. She simply felt the warmth of the water. The magic had not left her, it had changed. She no longer cried gold when she was sad. Instead, when she was truly happy, the flowers in her garden would bloom overnight, even in the middle of the dry season. She was no longer the girl whose tears were a curse. She was the woman whose peace was a blessing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Adama realized the greatest secret of all. The most valuable thing in the world isn't something you can dig out of the ground or weep into a pot. It's the freedom to cry a tear that is worth absolutely nothing to anyone but yourself.